Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
From 1942 to 1943, the Pacific War was at a crossroads between the advancement of the Japanese Empire and the Allied defenses in the southern Pacific. The U.S. Navy matched the Japanese Imperial Navy ships in the Solomon Islands at the Battle of Coral Reef in February 1942. The stalemate between Japan and the Allies had enabled the Japanese to establish communication lines across the Pacific. American reports from the Dutch East Indies expressed the strategic significance of the island of Java in Indonesia for regional plans against Japan. In addition, Australian island New Guinea was a highly contested territory between Imperial Japanese soldiers and the Australian soldiers. This tension incited the establishment of a defensive line between the occupied East Indies, present-day Indonesia, and the Australian coast. This article aims to contextualize the military struggle between Australia and Japan for Papua New Guinea, as well as the legal and political implications that went along with it. According to Japanese newspapers in occupied Kalimantan, by October 1942, the Japanese Navy destroyed 17 Australian convoys. This information not only conveys the threat of the Japanese Navy, but also demonstrates how much effort the Japanese Navy put into flaunting their reputation. Whilst Japan consolidated its gains in the former British Malaya and Dutch East Indies, Australia focused on building defenses against Japan, specifically in New Guinea. This defensive settlement arose from Australia's fear of invasion in February 1942. Despite fierce opposition from British Commonwealth forces, the Malay Peninsula was lost in 70 days, and Singapore in only a week. British Commonwealth and Dutch colonial forces were overwhelmed by their Japanese opponents and were forced to retreat to Australia. The last Dutch colonial forces defended Timor and West New Guinea until February 1943. Afterwards, Allied defenses against the Japanese were relegated to New Guinea, and was the only buffer between Australia and the rest of the Japanese-occupied Southeast Asia. Allied commanders, such as American General Douglas MacArthur and Dutch General Simon Spoor, withdrew from Southeast Asia to Australia as well, and would later contribute significantly to the Allied strategy in 1944 and 1945. Overall, the Australian defensive battlement at New Guinea and the efforts of Allied forces throughout the Pacific War were a cooperative effort to dislodge Japanese forces. In one such defensive effort, there was a commando force noted as the M Group that was tasked with establishing a radio station as a communication line within the contested Japanese territory in New Guinea. The M Group only consisted of 3 soldiers, part of a commando contingent in the Australian Army, and the joint Dutch-British-American force that retreated to Australia. However, this effort was thwarted by Japanese-aligned locals that gave up the group. Former Dutch Indies soldiers Private Pottiwal and Private Reheron and Australian Sergeant Leonard Stiffleet were executed by Japanese soldiers on a Papua New Guinea beachfront called Aitape Beach on the 24th of October, 1943. The soldiers were sadly photographed before meeting their tragic end. These photos were later found in 1945 and displayed during the trial of Japanese Vice Admiral Kimada, who ordered the execution of the soldiers. This evidence not only proved the crimes of the admiral for the execution of POWs, but also demonstrated the brutality of Japanese war crimes. Kimada was tried and executed for war crimes in 1947. According to trial records of Vice Admiral Michiaki Kimada from the military tribunal in Pontianak, Kalimantan, the Vice Admiral was charged with unlawful killing because he ordered the execution of victims without trial. Michiaki held notable commands during the Japanese Navy's efforts in New Guinea, such as the 22nd Base in Balikpapan in Kalimantan. He was noted in administering particular brutalities across Japanese holdings in Sulawesi, Kalimantan, as well as New Guinea. Michiaki ordered the killing of POWs such as Stifleit and civilians that he accused of plotting to sabotage Japan. In 1944, Michiaki authorized the killing and torture of Chinese civilians under the context of a suspected Chinese conspiracy in West Kalimantan. For the purpose of establishing order in the Japanese-occupied East Indies, the Japanese Navy had their own secret police force in the East Indies known as Tokkeitai, which served the interest of the Japanese Navy across their East Indies holdings. Led by Michiaki, Imperial Japanese Police Force Tokkeitai brought terror to Kalimantan through various means. For instance, Michiaki ordered the killing of 150 Chinese civilians in December 1944 due to accusations of conspiracy against Japan. Overall, the Tokkeitai used brutal force and boasted of Japan's victories through newspapers across the seas of the East Indies. The Japanese Navy officers waged war on the Allies and Indonesians alike. In the aftermath of the war, Vice Admiral Michiaki Kamada was tried and executed by a Dutch war tribunal in Pontianak, Kalimantan, under unlawful killings by the standards of international law. The photograph of Sergeant Stifleit's execution became one of the many symbols of war crimes during the Second World War. Sergeant Stifleit, Private Patiwal, and Private Reheran were some of the many soldiers that devoted themselves to the Allied front against the Empire of Japan. Allied efforts eventually led to the collapse of Japanese domination in Southeast Asia. The International Military Tribunal's interrogation and inspection of Japanese officers stationed in the New Guinea campaign proved their atrocities and war crimes. Not only was the Japanese Navy responsible for the brutal executions of Allied soldiers, but they were also accountable for the subjugation of the Indonesian and Chinese civilian populations inflicted by the Tokkeitai.